"Sell the horses and close the stables," the Duke ordered. The words, spoken in a voice devoid of all warmth, fell like stones into the quiet chill of the stable yard. Constance Abbott, standing beside the mounting block, did not flinch. She had been expecting this since the old Duke had passed, and his son, Gideon Devereux, the new Duke of Heron Court, had returned from a war that had left him colder than any winter. She had simply not expected it so soon. Her uncle, Simon Abbott, who had inherited the position of stablemaster from her father, but none of his skill, wrung his hands. "Your Grace, the cost of upkeep is considerable, I grant you, but the Devereux line of hunters is famed throughout the county." "The fame is a memory, and the cost is a burden," the Duke cut in. His gaze, the color of slate, swept over the immaculate cobblestones, the polished brass fittings on the stall doors, the neatly coiled ropes. It was a gaze that assessed and dismissed. He was a man who had seen cities burn. A collection of stone buildings and animals meant little. The Duchess, my late wife, had a fondness for them. I do not. They are a monument to a past I have no wish to revisit. Sell what you can. The rest, deal with them as you see fit. You have 1 month. He turned to leave, his tall, black-clad figure a slash of mourning against the pale morning light. But he stopped. His son, a small boy of 6 named Leopold, had slipped from his father's side. Silent as a shadow, the child had padded across the yard and now stood before the open door of the last stall. Inside, a young horse, a silver-dun colt not yet fully grown, shifted its weight and blew a soft breath through its nostrils. Constance held her own breath. She had raised that colt from a foal, the last of a line her father had spent a lifetime perfecting. A line bred not for speed or aggression, but for an almost preternatural calm. She called him Ghost. Little Lord Leopold, who had not spoken a single word since his mother's funeral 6 months prior, reached out a small, hesitant hand. He did not try to touch the horse. He simply held his hand in the air, palm up. Ghost lowered his elegant head, his soft muzzle hovering inches from the boy's fingers. For a long moment, the two of them stood locked in that silent communion. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, a grieving, silent child and a horse that understood silence. The Duke's jaw was a hard line. "Leo, come away." The boy did not move. He did not seem to have heard. "He will not harm him, Your Grace," Constance said, her voice quiet but clear. It was the first time she had spoken. Gideon's head snapped toward her. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. A woman in her early 20s, dressed in a plain, durable skirt and a man's cast-off waistcoat over her blouse. Her hands were clean but calloused, her face unadorned and serious, her brown hair pulled back in a severe knot. There was nothing remarkable about her, except for the utter stillness with which she met his gaze. She was not pleading or afraid. She was stating a fact. "And you are?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Constance Abbott, Your Grace. My father was Elias Abbott." Recognition flickered in his eyes. Elias had been more than a stablemaster. He had been an artist whose medium was bloodlines. "Your father is gone, and his work goes with him." "Not all of it," Constance said, nodding toward the stall. "That colt is the culmination of his life's ambition. A horse with a temperament so steady it can soothe a troubled mind. Your son knows it. He feels it." The Duke looked from Constance to his son, who was now gently stroking Ghost's forehead. A flicker of something, not warmth, but perhaps a crack in the ice, showed on Gideon's face. He saw his son, the boy who shrank from every touch and flinched at every raised voice, standing with a placid trust he had not shown to any living soul, man or beast, in half a year.
1 month, Abbot, the Duke repeated to her uncle, his voice like grinding stone.
But his eyes were on Constance. "The order stands." He strode away, and this time, after a long, lingering look at the horse, young Leo followed him. Constance let out the breath she had been holding. Her uncle, Simon, immediately rounded on her. "Constance, have you lost your mind? Contradicting the Duke. This is our livelihood. My livelihood. I am your guardian, and I will not have you jeopardizing my position." "Our position is already lost, uncle," she replied, turning to fetch a brush. "He wants the stables closed. Did you not hear him?" "We could have persuaded him. We could have shown him the ledgers, the value." "He does not care about value," Constance said, her voice flat. "He cares about forgetting." She walked into Ghost's stall and began to brush the colt's silver coat with long, practiced strokes. The horse leaned into her touch, his eyes soft. She thought of her father's hands, calloused like her own, turning the pages of his breeding records. She thought of the nights she had spent poring over those same books, memorizing every line, every note. And she thought of the small, silent boy with his father's sad eyes. She had 1 month. 1 month to prove that some things were not meant to be sold, or closed, or forgotten. Some things were meant to heal. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Work, however, sometimes did. The first week passed in a flurry of unwanted activity. Horse traders from Marley and beyond descended upon Heron Court like vultures, their eyes greedy. Simon, her uncle, preened under their coarse flattery, eager to make a good sale and secure a commission for himself. He paraded the hunters and carriage horses, extolling their virtues with a salesman's oily charm. Constance stayed in the background, her face a mask of quiet disapproval. She answered their technical questions with curt, precise facts that often undermined her uncle's flowery exaggerations, earning her sharp glares from him and grudging respect from the more knowledgeable buyers. The Duke remained absent, a ghost in his own house. But his son did not. Every morning, just after dawn, Leo would slip out of the great house and make his way to the stables. He never spoke. He would simply appear at Ghost's stall, a small, solemn figure, and watch as Constance went about her morning routine. She would talk to him, or rather, to the air around him, narrating her tasks in a low, even voice. "Now we give him his oats. Just a small measure, he's still growing. And fresh water, always fresh water. See how he drinks? He trusts that the water is clean. Trust is a quiet thing, isn't it?" Leo would listen, his dark eyes fixed on her or the horse. After a few days, he began to help. He would hold the bucket, his small hands gripping the handle tightly. He would pass her the softest brushes. They were small offerings, silent requests to be part of this peaceful world she curated within the stable walls. Constance accepted them with a simple nod, treating his presence as both natural and welcome. One morning, she was mending a piece of tack, her fingers moving with deft precision, when the Duke appeared at the stable door. He stood in the shadows, watching as his son handed Constance a length of waxed thread. Leo's face was animated with a quiet focus she had never seen on him before. Gideon stepped into the light. "The traders are making their final offers today," he said, without preamble. Constance did not look up from her work. "I am aware, Your Grace." "They have made an offer for all of them, a handsome one, From a Mr. Fletcher Vaughan. He wishes to purchase the entire stock, including the colt. Her needle paused for a fraction of a second. Mr. Vaughan is a man who values quantity over quality. He will break the bloodline, mix it with lesser stock for a quick profit. That is his prerogative as the owner, Gideon stated. It would be a waste of my father's life's work. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct. And it would be a cruelty to your son. At her words, Leo, who had frozen at the sound of his father's voice, took a half-step closer to Constance, his small hand resting on the edge of her work table. It was a gesture of alignment, of choosing a side. Gideon's eyes narrowed, taking in the small, defiant tableau. My son's welfare is my concern, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Is it? The question was out before Constance could stop it. It was insolent, unforgivable. She braced herself for the explosion, but it did not come. Instead, the Duke walked slowly toward them. He stopped before Ghost's stall and looked in at the calm, silver animal. My wife loved these stables. After she died, every stone seemed to mock me. Every whinny of a horse was a memory I could not bear. Closing it seemed necessary, the only way to cut out the pain. It was the most he had ever said to her, a confession laid bare in the dusty, hay-scented air. It was not an apology. It was an explanation. Grief is not a thing you can amputate, Your Grace, Constance said quietly. It is a wound that must be cleaned and dressed until it heals. He turned back to her, and his face was a mask of cold fury again, but his eyes held something else. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. The horses are sold. The deal with Mr. Vaughan is all but signed. However, he paused, his gaze dropping to his son, who was now watching him with wide, anxious eyes. The colt is not part of the sale. Nor are you. Constance felt a jolt, a dizzying surge of something she dared not name, hope. This is not a reprieve, Gideon continued, his voice hardening as if to counteract any softness. It is a transaction. You will remain in your cottage. You will care for this one horse. You will be paid a wage directly from my accounts, not through your uncle. Your sole employment is to ensure this animal remains a calming influence for my son. All other stables will be closed, the staff dismissed. The yard will be silent. Is that understood? Plainly, Your Grace, she said, her throat tight. Good. He looked down at his son. Leo, it is time for your lessons. For the first time, the boy resisted. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement, and his hand tightened its grip on Constance's table. The Duke's face clouded over. Before he could issue a command, Constance spoke. Perhaps Lord Leopold could have his lessons here, Your Grace. The fresh air might be beneficial, and Ghost is a quiet companion. Gideon looked at her, then at his son's pleading face. The silence stretched. He thought of the boy's tutor, a dour man who complained that Leo would not focus. He thought of the suffocating quiet of the great house, a quiet of absence and sorrow. Here, in the stables, the quiet was different. It was peaceful, alive. For 1 hour, he said, the words clipped. Then he returns to the house. I will inform his tutor. He turned and left without another word. Constance looked down at Leo. The boy gave her a small, tentative smile, the first she had ever seen. She had not saved the stables. Not really. She had only saved a single stall, an island in a sea of impending silence. But for the boy, and for the legacy of her father embodied in the silver colt, it was enough. It was a beginning. The arrangement was as stark as the Duke had promised. Within days, the other horses were gone, led away by Fletcher Vaughan's grooms. The stable block, once a place of bustling life, fell silent. Doors that had always stood open were now bolted shut. The smells of leather, horse, and hay began to fade, replaced by the damp, dusty scent of disuse.
It was a graveyard of memories, and Constance's small corner of it felt like the last lighted window in a deserted town. Her Uncle Simon was furious. He had been demoted from master of a prestigious stable to nothing. The Duke had paid him a small final sum and dismissed him from service at Heron Court. He now lived in the nearby town of Marley, and his visits to Constance's cottage were filled with bitter recriminations. "He keeps you on as a glorified nursemaid for that boy and that pale nag," he spat one afternoon, standing in her small garden, "while I, your guardian, am cast out. It is unnatural. You have bewitched him somehow." "I have done nothing but my work, Uncle," Constance replied, calmly weeding a patch of herbs. She was planting rosemary and lavender, things whose scents might bring a little life back to the air. "Your work? Your father's obsession is what it is. He filled your head with nonsense about temperament and bloodlines instead of teaching you how to be a proper woman. And now look, isolated, alone. You should have let the Duke sell the colt. With the money, we would have had nothing," Constance said, standing up and dusting the soil from her hands. "Money is spent. A legacy, if tended, can last forever." Her uncle sneered and left, muttering about her foolishness. But Constance was not alone. She had Leo. The boy's hour of lessons in the stable yard soon stretched to 2, then 3. His tutor, a surprisingly gentle man named Mr. Finch, found that Leo was more receptive here. He would trace letters in the dust of the yard, count stones from the path, and read aloud to Ghost, his small voice gaining confidence with each passing day. And then there was the Duke. Gideon began to make a habit of ending his day at the stables. He would not come into the yard, but would stand at the stone wall overlooking it, watching. He never interrupted the lessons or interfered with Constance's work. He simply observed, a dark, motionless figure against the setting sun. Constance was acutely aware of his presence. She felt his gaze as she groomed Ghost, as she explained the principles of hoof care to a rapt Leo, as she mended the worn leather of a headstall. She never acknowledged him, but his silent vigils became part of the rhythm of her days. One evening, as dusk was settling, he finally spoke. "The farrier is coming tomorrow," he called down from the wall, "for the workhorses at the home farm." "Ghost's hooves are trimmed and balanced, Your Grace," she answered, not breaking her rhythm as she polished a bit. "I saw to them myself last week." There was a pause. "You are trained as a farrier?" "My father believed a good horseman should know every aspect of the animal's care. He taught me." Another silence. Then, "The west meadow is overgrown. The grass is rich. The colt could be turned out there." "The fences are in disrepair, Your Grace," she said. "And there's a patch of yew in the far corner. It's poison to horses." He was quiet for so long she thought he had gone. But then he said, his voice lower, "Show me." She put down her work, her heart hammering. She led him, with Leo trailing silently behind them,
out of the stable yard and along the path to the west meadow. The evening was cool, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. As they walked, she pointed out the rotted posts, the sagging wire. At the far corner, nestled under the shade of an old oak, was the dark green of the yew tree. "My father always said to walk the land," she explained, "to know it as well as you know your horse. He made maps of every pasture, marking the good grazing, the bad weeds, the marshy spots." Gideon looked from the toxic tree to her face, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Where are these maps?" "In my father's ledgers, in the cottage." "Bring them to the house tomorrow," he commanded. "The main library. After Leo's lessons." It was not a request. It was an order, but it felt like something more. It felt like a door creaking open. The next day, Constance presented herself at the great house, a heavy leather-bound ledger under her arm. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Vickers, who had been at Heron Court for 30 years, showed her into the library. The room was vast and cold, the air thick with the smell of old paper and beeswax. Bookshelves soared to the ceiling, and a fine layer of dust covered everything. Like the stables, this room felt unused, abandoned. Gideon was standing by a massive fireplace, a stack of papers in his hand. "The estate accounts," he said by way of greeting. "A chaotic mess. My father was a sentimentalist, not a businessman." He gestured to a large table. "The maps." Constance opened the ledger. Her father's hand, precise and elegant, filled the pages. There were not just maps, but detailed notes on soil composition, drainage, and crop rotation, all interspersed with the genealogy of his beloved horses. It was a complete record of the land and the animals it sustained. Gideon studied the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. Constance answered them with the clarity and detail of someone who had committed every word to memory. For over an hour, they were not a duke and a stable hand. They were two experts immersed in a shared problem. "This is meticulous," he said at last, looking up at her. The respect in his voice was undisguised. "Why was this not being used?" "My uncle did not value it," she said simply. "He saw it as old ramblings." "He is a fool," Gideon stated, as if it were an established fact. He closed the ledger gently. "Leave this with me. I will have it copied. Your father's knowledge will not be wasted." He paused. "Mrs. Vickers will bring you some tea." It was a dismissal, but as she left the cold, silent library, Constance felt a strange sense of victory. He had seen the value. He had seen her father's work, and by extension, he had seen hers. When Mrs. Vickers arrived, she carried a tray with not only tea, but also a plate of warm seed cakes. The housekeeper's face was as severe as ever, but her voice was a fraction softer. "The Duke has not spent this long in the library since the Duchess passed," she said, setting the tray down. "And young Lord Leopold, he spoke a word today. To his tutor. He said the colt's name." Constance's breath caught in her throat. "Ghost," she whispered. "I, Ghost." Mrs. Vickers looked at Constance, her shrewd eyes taking in the plain dress, the capable hands. "You are a strange girl, Constance Abbott. But you seem to be bringing this sad house a bit of luck." As Constance drank her tea, alone in the vast echoing hall, she allowed herself a small, fragile sliver of hope. Perhaps she wasn't just tending a wound. Perhaps, just perhaps, She was planting a garden in the ruins. The quiet transformation of Heron Court began not with a grand gesture, but with the steady tap of a hammer. A few days after their meeting in the library, 2 estate workers appeared at the West Meadow. Under the Duke's orders, they began to repair the fences. The yew tree was felled and its roots dug out. Within a week, the pasture was secure. Constance led Ghost and Leo into the newly opened field. The colt, overjoyed at the space and the lush grass, gave a buck of delight and took off in a long, graceful canter. Leo laughed. It was not a full-throated laugh, but a short, sharp burst of sound, like a bird taking flight. He ran after the horse, his small legs pumping, a look of pure joy on his face. From his study window in the main house, Gideon watched them. He had his father-in-law's breeding ledger open on his desk, its pages a testament to a quiet, methodical genius he was beginning to understand. He saw his son, a boy he thought he had lost to a silent world of grief, running and laughing in the sun.
He saw the woman who had made it possible, standing calmly by the gate, her presence a quiet anchor in the boy's joyful storm. It was not a miracle. It was the result of patience, competence, and a deep, instinctual understanding he himself lacked. A feeling he could not name, a mix of gratitude and a strange, protective admiration, began to stir in the cold chambers of his heart. This marked a shift. The Duke began to actively manage his estate, using Elias Abbott's ledgers as his guide. He directed the rotation of crops, the clearing of neglected woodlands, the dredging of a silted-up stream. He did not consult Simon Abbott or any of the other local landowners who had taken advantage of his father's lax management. He consulted the meticulous notes of a dead stable-master, and through them, he consulted Constance. Their meetings became a regular occurrence. He would send a footman to summon her to the library, and they would pore over the maps and accounts. He spoke to her as an equal, his questions direct, his attention absolute. He started calling her Miss Abbott. It was a small thing, a formal courtesy, but in the rigid hierarchy of Heron Court, it was an earthquake. The staff took notice. Mrs. Vickers's approval, once signaled by a plate of seed cakes, now became more overt. She would ensure a fire was lit in the library before Constance arrived, and the tea was always the finest blend. The gruff head gardener, a man named Perkin, tipped his hat to her and offered her cuttings from the greenhouse for her cottage garden. They saw the life returning to the estate, the purpose in the Duke's eyes, the laughter of his son, and they knew its source. The revival of Heron Court did not go unnoticed by the wider county. It was discussed with curiosity at tea tables and in the marketplace in Marley, and it drew the attention of Lady Arabella Sinclair. Lady Arabella was a woman of impeccable breeding, polished beauty, and formidable ambition. Her family's estate bordered Heron Court, and before the Duchess's death, it had been widely assumed that a union between her younger brother and the Devereux family was a possibility. With the Duke now a widower, Arabella had adjusted her sights. She saw in Gideon a prize, a title, wealth, and a position of power she craved. She arrived at Heron Court one brilliant autumn afternoon in a gleaming carriage, ostensibly to offer her condolences, though they were many months late. She was all honeyed sympathy and polished charm. "Dearest Gideon," she said, taking his hand in the grand entrance hall, "you have been a stranger for too long. We have all been so worried. This great house, so empty. You must not close yourself off from the world." She swept through the house, her silks rustling, her voice carrying.
She brought with her the world the Duke had shut out, a world of social obligation, polite insincerities, and subtle power plays. And she immediately identified Constance as a threat. She saw her for the first time in the stable yard. Constance was teaching Leo how to measure out feed, the boy concentrating fiercely, the silver colt watching them with placid eyes. Lady Arabella, escorted by the Duke, paused at the stone wall. "Good heavens, Gideon," she said, her voice a delicate murmur. "Is that Elias Abbott's girl? I had heard you kept her on. It seems irregular. She has the boy looking like a common stable lad." "She is Miss Abbott," Gideon corrected her, his voice cool. "And my son is happy." Arabella's smile was flawless, but her eyes were sharp. "Of course, dear boy. A child's happiness is paramount. But one must be so careful about influences. A girl like that, she might get ideas above her station, especially with such a handsome and available Duke now in residence." The insinuation was as subtle and as poisonous as the yew tree Constance had warned him about. Gideon's face hardened. "Miss Abbott's station is that of a valued expert in my employ. Her ideas are invariably practical and intelligent. I suggest you do not misjudge her." The rebuke was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Lady Arabella's smile did not waver, but a new, dangerous light entered her eyes. She had expected a grieving, pliable man. She had found something, or someone, else standing in her way. She was not a woman who tolerated obstacles. She preferred to remove them. Her first move was to invite her brother, Fletcher Vaughan, to stay. He was the very man who had bought the Duke's horses, and he arrived with an air of bluff camaraderie. He praised the improvements to the estate, his eyes lingering on the thriving pastures. "Remarkable turnaround, Devereux," he said one evening over dinner. "Heard you've been relying on old Abbott's notes. The man was a bit of an eccentric, wasn't he? All that fuss about temperament. A horse is muscle and bone, speed and power. That's what wins races. That's what commands a price." He directed a charming smile at Constance, who had been commanded by the Duke to attend the dinner to discuss the spring planting, a decision that had caused Lady Arabella's lips to thin to a barely visible line. "Miss Abbott, I believe you hold to your father's theories?" Vaughan continued. "I have one of his line, a fine hunter, strong as an ox, but skittish. Nearly threw a groom last week. Temperament, you see. You can't breed for what's between the ears." Constance met his gaze calmly. "You can, Mr. Vaughan, if you have the patience and the discipline. A horse's mind is as much a part of its breeding as the length of its legs. Perhaps the horse was not skittish. Perhaps the groom was simply a poor rider." The air crackled. Lady Arabella gave a tinkling laugh to break the tension. "Such a fierce defender of your father's work. It is quite admirable in its own way." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Fletcher Vaughan was considered an expert. He had cast a shadow on the Abbott legacy, and by extension, on Constance's own expertise. Over the next few days, the attacks became more direct. Arabella would make sighing comments about how much time the Duke was spending on farm matters instead of his social duties, her eyes flicking to Constance. Vaughan, meanwhile, began to sow discord among the estate staff, questioning the Duke's new methods, hinting that they were based on the fanciful notions of an uneducated girl. The escalation came when Vaughan took an intense interest in Ghost. He would linger by the west meadow, watching the colt. "A pretty thing," he remarked to the Duke one day. "Unusual color, but no real substance to him. Look at the bone structure. Too fine. He'll never have stamina. It's a dead end, that line. Your father-in-law was chasing a dream. My son is fond of him, was all Gideon would say. The true attack, when it came, was meticulously planned. The annual Marley County Fair was approaching, an event where landowners displayed their finest livestock. Lady Arabella, in her role as the county's leading lady, suggested that the Duke ought to make an appearance. It would signal his return to public life. "And you must show the colt," she trilled, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "The whole county is whispering about this special horse. It would be a wonderful way to honor Elias Abbott's memory. Fletcher could even present him for you. His expertise would lend such credibility." Gideon was hesitant, but the logic was sound. It would be a public declaration of his faith in the Abbott line. He agreed, but he made one change. "Mr. Vaughan will not present the horse," he stated, his eyes meeting Constance's across the library table. "Miss Abbott will. She will explain the breeding. She will answer any questions." It was a public test, and a public declaration of trust. For Lady Arabella and Fletcher Vaughan, it was an intolerable challenge, and they had no intention of allowing Constance to succeed. They would not just discredit her, they would humiliate her, and the Duke along with her. The stage was set for a public reckoning, and Constance knew, with a cold certainty, that her quiet life at Heron Court was about to be shattered. The days leading up to the Marley Fair were thick with a tension that even the animals seemed to feel. Constance prepared Ghost with meticulous care, her focus absolute. She brushed his silver coat until it shone like moonlight on water. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, trying to insulate him from the nervous energy that emanated from the great house. She knew she was not just preparing a horse for exhibition. She was preparing her father's legacy and her own future for a public trial. Lady Arabella and her brother were models of helpfulness. Vaughan offered advice on the best type of feed to build muscle, while Arabella fussed over what Constance should wear, offering to lend her a suitable riding habit. Constance politely refused all of it. She trusted her own methods and would wear her own plain, perfectly fitted habit. Her quiet refusal to be managed only hardened their resolve. The day before the fair, the incident occurred. Constance had taken Ghost for a final, gentle ride along the paths bordering the woods. He was calm, responsive, his gait as smooth as silk. Leo had accompanied them on his small pony, his chatter a happy counterpoint to the rhythmic hoofbeats. When they returned to the stables, one of Vaughan's grooms, a surly man named Hob, was waiting. "Mr. Vaughan sent me to help, miss," he said, reaching for Ghost's reins, "to give him a final rub-down before the big day." Constance felt a prickle of unease. "That won't be necessary. I will see to him myself." "Mr. Vaughan insisted," the groom said, his tone bordering on insolent. "Says the Duke wants everything perfect." Reluctantly, Constance handed over the reins, her eyes never leaving the man as he led Ghost into his stall. She busied herself with Leo's pony, but her senses were on high alert. She heard the usual sounds of grooming, but something felt wrong. A few minutes later, Hob emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "All done, miss?" He gave a curt nod and left. Constance immediately went into the stall. Ghost seemed agitated. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, his ears twitching nervously. He shied away from her touch, his skin quivering. It was a complete reversal of his normal, placid nature. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She ran her hands over him, checking for injury, but found nothing. She checked his feed, his water. All was normal. Yet the horse was clearly distressed. Just then, the Duke and his guests walked into the stable yard. Vaughan's eyes went immediately to the restless colt.
"Ah," he said, a note of faux concern in his voice. "Just as I feared. The temperament is unstable. See how he spooks at nothing. It's in the blood. My hunter does the same. It's a shame, Devereaux. A real shame." Gideon's face was a stony mask. He looked at the agitated horse, then at Constance's pale, worried face. "Miss Abbott, what is this?"
"I don't know, Your Grace," she said, her voice strained. "He was perfectly calm just moments ago. Something has happened." "Or perhaps," Lady Arabella purred, "his true nature is simply showing itself under pressure. It is often the way with highly strung things." Her gaze flickered meaningfully towards Constance. The crisis had arrived. The carefully constructed trust between Constance and the Duke was fracturing before her eyes. His primary concern had always been his son's safety. Now, the animal he had entrusted with that safety looked volatile and unpredictable. "You told me he was gentle," Gideon said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a judge's sentence. Doubt, cold and corrosive, filled the space between them. Constance felt the sting of it, sharp as a slap. She could see the triumph in Vaughan's eyes, the satisfaction on Arabella's face. She could feel Leo shrinking back, his hand clutching her skirt, his joy extinguished. In that moment, she could have crumbled. She could have wept or pleaded. Instead, she drew a deep breath. She straightened her shoulders. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Look for the evidence. The horse will always tell you the truth, if you know how to listen." "Something is wrong," she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "This is not his nature. I ask for one night, Your Grace. Allow me one night to find the truth." She did not beg. She made a professional request. "Do not let them undo my father's work and your son's peace with a single lie." Gideon looked at her, at the unwavering honesty in her eyes. He saw not a hysterical girl, but a competent woman facing a crisis. He saw his son, hiding behind her as if she were a shield. Then he looked at Fletcher Vaughan, whose expression of concern seemed suddenly too practiced, too smooth. He made a choice. "One night," he said, his authority ringing like steel. "The horse will not be shown at the fair tomorrow unless Miss Abbott deems him fit. And until then, no one is to enter this stable but her." He shot a hard look at Vaughan's groom, who flinched and looked away. The Duke turned and strode back to the house, leaving an enraged Arabella and a calculating Vaughan in his wake. Constance did not waste a second. As darkness fell, she lit a lantern and began her investigation. She dismissed a distraught Leo into the care of Mrs. Vickers, promising him she would make Ghost well. Then she returned to the stall and began a systematic examination worthy of her father. She started with the horse himself, speaking to him constantly, her voice a low murmur. His skin still trembled, and he flinched when she touched his back. Her hands moved over his withers, his spine, his flanks. Nothing. Then, as she ran her hand along the underside of his belly, he flinched violently. She brought the lantern closer. There, almost invisible against his pale coat, was a faint redness, a slight swelling of the skin. It was an irritation, not an injury, but an application of something. Her mind raced. What could cause such a thing? A blistering agent? Nettles? She thought back. The groom, Hob. He had a rag in his hand when he left.
She scanned the stall, her eyes missing nothing. In the corner, half buried in the clean straw, she saw it. A small, crumpled piece of cloth. She picked it up carefully. It was coarse, like a piece of sacking, and it carried a faint, acrid smell. She recognized it instantly. It was a paste made from the stinging nettle root, a folk remedy sometimes used cruelly to make a lazy horse appear more spirited. It created a persistent, maddening itch without leaving a visible wound. It was a coward's trick, a cheat's trick. She had the evidence, but she needed more. She needed the link to Vaughn. She banked the lantern and slipped out of the stables, a silent shadow moving through the night. She made her way not to the great house, but to the servants' quarters, to the rooms above the carriage house where the visiting grooms were lodged. She found Hobbs' room. A dim light shone from under the door. She could hear the murmur of voices. She pressed her ear to the wood. "Told you she was sharp," she heard Hobb grumble. "She was watching me like a hawk." "It doesn't matter," came Fletcher Vaughan's voice, low and impatient. "The damage is done. The Duke saw the horse. By morning he'll be half mad with the itch. When he acts up at the fair, Devereux will have no choice but to believe me. He'll be desperate to get rid of the animal, and I'll be there to take it off his hands for a pittance. The girl will be disgraced and dismissed, and the Duke will be free of her influence." There was a chink of coins. "This is for your trouble. Now get some sleep, and stay away from the stables." Constance backed away from the door, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. She had it all, the physical evidence and the overheard confession. She did not go to the Duke, not yet. The lie had been planted in public. The truth, she decided, would be revealed in the same way. She returned to Ghost's stall and, using a soothing balm of her own creation, began to gently treat the colt's irritated skin. She worked through the night, and by dawn the horse was calm again, his trust in her restored. He was ready, and so was she. The morning of the Marley Fair dawned bright and clear. A sense of nervous excitement filled the air at Heron Court. Lady Arabella was radiant, dressed in a fashionable gown of deep blue, her confidence restored. Fletcher Vaughan was the picture of a country gentleman, ready to enjoy a day of sport. They believed they had already won. Constance, pale but composed after her sleepless night, met the Duke in the stable yard. Ghost stood beside her, a picture of tranquility. Leo held his lead rope, his small face alight with pride. "He is fit to be shown, Your Grace," Constance said, her voice clear and steady. Gideon's eyes searched hers. He saw no fear, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. "Very well," he said. "We will proceed as planned." At the fairgrounds, a large ring had been set up for the livestock exhibition. The gentry of the county filled the viewing stands, their voices a low hum of gossip and speculation. The appearance of the Duke of Heron Court was a major event, and the story of his mysterious, reclusive stable hand and her special colt had spread like wildfire. When the announcer called for the Devereux entry, a hush fell over the crowd. Constance led Ghost into the center of the ring. She did not look at the stands, at the hundreds of eyes on her. She focused only on the horse, her touch on his neck a constant reassurance. Fletcher Vaughan, standing near the judges' table, stepped forward. "If I may, gentlemen," he said, his voice projecting easily. "While Miss Abbott has done a fine job with the colt's presentation, there are some concerns about the temperament of this particular bloodline. An inherent volatility. It would be irresponsible not to mention it.
Heads nodded in the stands. Mr. Vaughan was a known expert. His word carried weight. This was the moment he had planned, the public denunciation. Before Constance could speak, the Duke's voice cut through the air, cold and clear. Mr. Vaughan's concern is noted. Gideon Devereux stepped down from the stand and walked into the ring, stopping beside Constance. The crowd murmured in surprise. A duke entering the ring like a common handler? However, Gideon continued, his gaze locking with Vaughan's, my own expert has a different assessment. Miss Abbott, perhaps you would enlighten us as to the colt's true nature. Constance's heart swelled. He had called her his expert, publicly. She turned to the judges. My father, Elias Abbott, bred this line for 3 decades. He sought to create a horse with a calm mind and a trusting heart. Ghost is the culmination of that work. He is, by nature, one of the gentlest animals you will ever meet. Vaughan laughed, a short, condescending bark. A lovely sentiment, but yesterday this very horse was a quivering wreck, ready to bolt at a shadow. Ask the Duke. He saw it himself. Indeed I did, Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. And I wondered at such a sudden change. Miss Abbott, you informed me you had discovered the cause? This was her cue. Constance looked directly at Fletcher Vaughan. The colt was not suffering from a volatile temperament, Mr. Vaughan. He was suffering from the deliberate application of a painful irritant to his skin. A paste made from nettle root, designed to make him seem wild and unpredictable. A gasp went through the crowd. Vaughan's face paled. This is an outrageous accusation. A hysterical fantasy from a girl trying to cover for her own failure. Is it? Constance asked softly. She reached into the pocket of her riding jacket and pulled out the small, coarse piece of cloth. This was found in the colt's stall after your groom, a man named Hobb, gave him his final rub-down. It carries the scent of the paste, and I am sure a physician could identify the residue. Vaughan was speechless, his face a mask of fury and panic. Furthermore, the Duke said, his voice ringing with authority, a witness overheard Mr. Vaughan last night confessing his plan to the groom and paying him for his part in this deception. All eyes swung to a figure standing at the edge of the ring. It was the Dowager Duchess, Gideon's mother, Lady Honora Devereux. She was a formidable old woman with eyes that missed nothing. She had arrived at Heron Court late the previous night, and Constance, on a desperate gamble, had gone to her and told her everything. The Dowager, a woman who prized honesty and despised cheats, had listened intently. She had then positioned herself outside the groom's quarters. The walls of the carriage house are quite thin, the Dowager announced, her voice crisp and carrying. Especially when one is speaking of bribery and fraud. I heard every word. Mr. Vaughan, you are a disgrace to your name. And Arabella, she said, her gaze sweeping up to the stands where Lady Sinclair sat frozen in horror. Your ambition has finally curdled into poison. You will not be welcome at Heron Court again. The public reckoning was absolute. The humiliation was total. Fletcher Vaughan, exposed as a cheat and a fraud, practically fled the fairgrounds. Lady Arabella, her face white with fury, was left to face the condemning stares and whispers of the entire county. That is how counties turn on their own. Quietly, by degrees, and then all at once. In the center of the ring, in the sudden quiet, Gideon turned to Constance. The noise, the crowd, the judges, they all faded away. There was only her, standing tall and vindicated, and the calm, trusting horse beside her. "You said you needed one night to find the truth," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You did more than that. You saved his legacy." He nodded toward the sky, a gesture for her father. "And you saved my son. And I believe you have saved me." He did something then that stunned the entire county into silence. The Duke of Heron Court, in the middle of the exhibition ring, went down on one knee before the stablemaster's daughter. It was not the gesture of a supplicant, but of a king acknowledging an equal. "I have been living in a house of ghosts, Constance Abbott, a house of memory and grief. You have filled it with life. I am asking you not to be my expert or my employee. I am asking you to be my wife, to be my partner, to rebuild Heron Court with me. I choose this. I choose you. Plainly." Tears she had refused to shed in grief or fear now welled in her eyes. Tears of joy, of overwhelming relief. She looked at this proud, cold man who had thawed before her eyes, and at his son, who was beaming at her side. She looked at the silver horse who had been the vessel of her father's dream. She gave him her hand. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all the weight of her heart. "Yes, together." The epilogue of their story was written not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet, steady rhythms of a life rebuilt. 1 year after the Marley Fair, the sign at the entrance to the stables at Heron Court was replaced. The new one, carved from seasoned oak, read, "The Abbott Devereux Stud." The stable yard, once silent and desolate, was now home to a half-dozen carefully chosen mares, the foundation of a new breeding program based entirely on Elias Abbott's principles. The air was once again rich with the scent of horses, hay, and honest work.
Constance, now the Duchess of Heron Court, was not a woman transformed by silks and jewels. She was the same steady, competent woman she had always been, though a quiet joy now illuminated her features. She still wore practical skirts for her work in the stables. Her hands still knew the feel of leather and a currycomb, but now a simple gold band gleamed on her finger. Gideon was a changed man. The ice in his heart had melted completely, replaced by a deep, abiding warmth. He was no longer a ghost in his own house. He worked alongside his wife, his respect for her knowledge as profound as his love. He learned the language of the ledgers, the poetry of the bloodlines, and found a satisfaction in building a legacy that was far greater than merely managing a fortune. And Leo, who had once been lost to silence, was now a bright, chattering boy of 8. He had his father's eyes, but his mother's easy smile, and he was a fearless rider. He would spend his afternoons assisting Constance, his small voice piping up with surprisingly astute observations about the horses, his grandfather's gift flowing through his veins. One crisp autumn afternoon, Gideon found Constance in the office she had established in the stables, the very room that had once been her father's. She was bent over a new ledger, its leather cover smooth and unmarked. "What are you doing?" he asked, his arms circling her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Starting a new line," she said, pointing to a page where 2 names were written, Ghost, and a beautiful mare they had recently acquired. "I think Father would approve." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small, flat box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not a jewel, but a beautifully crafted silver pen. Engraved on its side were 2 words, plainly, together. Constance lifted her head and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss, filled with the comfortable certainty of a love that had been earned, not just declared. "It's perfect," she whispered. Later that evening, as the sun set over the west meadow, they stood at the stone wall, watching Ghost canter through the tall grass, his coat gleaming in the golden light. Leo was with him, not riding but running alongside, his laughter carrying on the cool air. The house behind them was no longer cold and silent. Every window was aglow, a beacon of warmth and life. The wound of grief had not been amputated. It had been cleaned and dressed, and it had healed into a scar that was no longer painful to the touch, but a reminder of the resilience of the human heart. Here, in the quiet of their shared world, they had found more than just peace. They had built a home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.